Malaria has killed more human beings than every war in history combined. And for over 300 years, there was only one cure. Not a pill, not a lab creation. A piece of bark from a tree in Peru. The indigenous Quechua people had been using it for centuries. They called it quina-quina, the holy bark. But here's the thing. When European colonizers found out what this bark could do, they didn't just claim it. They locked the Quechua out of their own medicine, burned the forest to control the supply, and built the world's first pharmaceutical cartel around a single tree. And the worst part, the man who finally broke that monopoly wasn't rewarded. He was beaten to death for it. This is the story of the fever tree, the most fought-over plant in human history. Deep in the Andes Mountains, the Quechua people knew something that Western medicine would not figure out for another 200 years. They ground the bark of the cinchona tree into powder, mixed it with sweetened water, and drank it to stop uncontrollable shivering. They called it quina-quina, the holy bark. They had been doing this long before any European ever set foot in South America. Now, here is what is interesting. The Quechua were not using it for malaria specifically. Malaria did not exist at the high altitudes where they lived. They used it for cold-induced fevers, but the connection they made, bark stops shivering, bark stops fever, turned out to be one of the most important medical discoveries in human history. In 1605, a Jesuit apothecary named Agostino Salambrino arrived in Lima. He watched the Quechua drinking their bark tea, and he made a leap. Back in Rome, thousands were dying from marsh fever, what we now call malaria. Same symptom, uncontrollable shivering, same potential cure. On the 31st of May 1631, a ship left the port of Callao, carrying bales of powdered cinchona bark. 6 months later, it arrived at the Santo Spirito Hospital in Rome. The results were immediate. Patients who had been shaking to death were walking out of the hospital within days. Now you would think this would be celebrated, a cure for one of the deadliest diseases on Earth, freely given by indigenous knowledge. But that is not what happened. Not even close. You've probably heard the story of the Countess of Cinchon. The tale says a Spanish noblewoman was cured by this bark in Peru, and that is why the tree is named cinchona. It is in every textbook. There is just one problem. It never happened. The countess they named died 3 years before her husband even arrived in Peru. Historians debunked it decades ago, but the name stuck. The Quechua word quina-quina was erased from the botanical record, replaced by the name of a woman who never touched the bark. That erasure was not an accident. It was the beginning of a pattern. Now the Jesuit discovery was extraordinary. But what happened next is where this story turns dark. The moment Europe realized this bark could save lives, they stopped asking the Quechua for help and started taking it by force. Spain moved fast. By 1751, the Crown had established royal reserves in Loja, modern-day Ecuador, to control every cinchona tree in the empire. The bark was harvested under armed guard, and it was shipped exclusively to the royal pharmacy in Madrid. Here is the critical detail. The export of cinchona seeds or saplings was banned, not restricted. Banned. Think about that for a second. The Quechua had used this bark for centuries. They discovered it. They taught the colonizers how to prepare it, and now they were forbidden from growing it themselves. This was the bark monopoly, and it was not just Spain. After South American nations gained independence in the early 1800s, Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, and Bolivia all continued the export ban. The bark was too valuable. At its peak, cinchona bark was worth more per pound than gold. Entire forests were stripped bare. Harvesters did not bother collecting bark sustainably. They felled the whole tree, stripped it, and moved on. By the 1850s, the wild cinchona forest that the Quechua had managed for centuries were being destroyed at an alarming rate. The colonizers were not just stealing the medicine, they were killing the source. But here is what nobody expected. 2 men were about to pull off one of the greatest heists in botanical history, and it would change the balance of global power forever. Now, up to this point, the story is already disturbing enough. Colonial powers stole indigenous medicine, and they banned the very people who discovered it from using it. But what came next makes all of that look like a prelude. In 1860, a British civil servant named Clements Markham sailed to Peru with one mission: to steal cinchona seeds and break South America's monopoly. He brought along a botanist named Richard Spruce. They framed it as philanthropy, saving the trees from destruction. What it actually was botanical piracy, state-sponsored theft of indigenous knowledge. They succeeded. Seeds were smuggled to British India. Plantations were established in Ceylon and Burma. Within 20 years, they were producing 220,000 kilograms of bark annually. There was just one problem. The British chose the wrong species. Their bark had low quinine content, good enough for basic treatment, but not good enough to dominate the global supply. That is where this story's real tragedy begins. An English trader named Charles Ledger had lived in South America for decades. Years earlier, he had rescued a drowning indigenous man named Manuel Incra Mamani, a Bolivian bark hunter of Quechua and Aymara descent. Mamani became Ledger's closest collaborator. Mamani knew something that no European botanist did, which cinchona trees produced the highest concentration of quinine. For 4 years, Mamani searched. Frost destroyed his first collections. He kept going. In 1865, he finally gathered seeds from a cinchona variety that contained up to 13% quinine in its bark. The standard species contained 2 to 4%. This was the holy grail. Ledger sent the seeds to his brother in London. George Ledger offered them to the British government. The British refused. The Dutch government bought them instead. The price was 100 guilders. 100 guilders for seeds that would go on to control 97% of the world's quinine supply. One of the most consequential bargains in pharmaceutical history. Now you are probably wondering what happened to Mamani, the man who actually found the seeds, the man whose expertise made all of this possible. In 1871, Mamani was arrested by Bolivian authorities on another seed collecting expedition. He was imprisoned and beaten severely. After his release, he died from his injuries. The locals considered him a traitor for helping foreigners steal their trees. The botanical world named the species Cinchona ledgeriana, after Ledger, not Mamani. The man who did the work was erased, just like the Quechua word quina-quina had been erased 2 centuries before. Now, Mamani seeds did not just change the quinine trade, they created a monopoly so total that when it collapsed, it nearly cost the Allies the Second World War. The Dutch planted Mamani seeds on the Pengalengan Plateau in Java. The results were extraordinary. By the 1930s, Dutch plantations in Java were producing 22 million pounds of cinchona bark every single year. That was 97% of the global supply, all from one man's seeds grown on one island. In 1913, the Dutch formalised this into something called the Quina Bureau, headquartered in Amsterdam. It was the world's first pharmaceutical cartel. Every cinchona producer had to deliver bark at prices set by the Bureau. The Bureau controlled production, distribution, and pricing worldwide. One product, one point of control. Sound familiar? Then in 1942, Japan invaded Java, and overnight, the Allies lost access to 95% of the world's quinine. The consequences were catastrophic. In the Pacific Theatre alone, over 60% of all soldiers contracted malaria. At Guadalcanal, more than 80% of US Marines were hospitalized for malaria within 9 months. Across the entire war, malaria caused more casualties than the Japanese military. The only substitute was a synthetic drug called atabrine. It worked, but the side effects were brutal. It turned soldiers' skin bright yellow, caused nausea and headaches, and rumours spread that it caused sterility. Marines spat the pills out rather than take them. All because the entire world's supply of a life-saving medicine had been concentrated on a single island, controlled by a single cartel, grown from seeds stolen from a single man who was beaten to death for collecting them. Now, here is where this story comes full circle. Because the solution to the quinine crisis did not come from a Western laboratory. It came from the same place the original cure did: indigenous plant knowledge. In 1967, with North Vietnamese soldiers dying from drug-resistant malaria, Chairman Mao launched a secret program called Project 5223. Over 500 scientists in 60 laboratories began combing through traditional Chinese herbal texts. A researcher named Yu was assigned to lead a key team. Her group tested 380 plant extracts from 200 species. The breakthrough came from a 1600-year-old text, a 4th century manuscript by a physician named Hong. It described soaking sweet wormwood in cold water, not boiling it. Tu realized heat was destroying the active compound. She switched to low-temperature extraction. In October 1971, extract number 191 achieved 100% inhibition of the malaria parasite. The compound was named artemisinin. Tu Yu received the Nobel Prize in 2015. She was the first mainland Chinese scientist to win one in a scientific category. She had no doctorate, no medical degree, and no training abroad. And here's the detail that ties everything together. Artemisinin came from an ancient herbal tradition, just like quinine came from the Quechua. Both times the cure already existed in indigenous knowledge. Both times it took centuries for the rest of the world to listen. Today, malaria still kills over 600,000 people every year. 95% of them are in Africa. Most of them are children under 5. And the bark that could have changed everything, the tree Mamani died for? It still grows in the mountains of Peru and Bolivia. The Quechua descendants still know its name, quina-quina, the holy bark. The question was never whether the cure existed. The question was always who got to control it. If this story changed the way you think about where medicine really comes from, subscribe, because this is just the beginning.